Hi. Hello. My name is Stephanie and welcome, or if you're coming back, welcome back. Either way, I'm glad you're here and I hope you're well. And today we're talking about the third book in the Dollenganger series, If There Be Thorns by V.C. Andrews. So spoilers for the aforementioned If There Be Thorns, as well as the previous two novels in the series, Petals on the Wind and Flowers in the Attic, but flip the order because I'm going to be referencing events from both of those. And also, content warning for reference child abuse and child neglect, animal abuse, misogyny, religious abuse, animal neglect, self-harm, threats of suicide and self-harm, animal death, and incest. It continues to be a lot. Now, before we get into the story, I want to talk about some timeline stuff. Full disclosure, this isn't going to be a full and complete timeline of every single event in the series because we'd be here all day if we did it like that. I do want to hit the broad strokes of the timelines of each of the three books that we've talked about so far. So for your reference, we're not going to be talking about Garden of Shadows, the prequel novel, or the final book in the series, Seeds of Yesterday. We'll cross those bridges when we get to them. So let's talk about ages. So Chris was born in 1942, Cathy in 1945, and Corey and Carrie in 1952. So they were 14, 12, and 5 respectively when they were locked in the attic, and 17, 15, and 8 when they escaped 3 years later. Flowers in the Attic takes place over the course of 3 years, from April 1957 to November of 1960. 1957 is the year that Christopher Sr. dies, and Corinne takes the kids to Foxworth Hall, and they are locked in the attic. 2 years later, in 1959, Corinne marries Bart Winslow. That same year, her father Malcolm dies. A year later, just before Halloween, Corey dies from arsenic poisoning when he is 8 years old. This is when the kids finally escape the attic and are found by Henny and taken in by Paul. That brings us to Petals on the Wind, which takes place over the course of 16 years, which is the longest time span of the original 4 novels, and it takes place immediately after the end of Flowers in the Attic, so from November 1960 to April 1976. Corey, Cathy's oldest son, who she has with Julian Marquette, is born in 1969. A couple years later, in 1972, Carrie dies. She is 20 years old when she passes away. This is also when Foxworth Hall burns down, Corinne is institutionalized, Olivia and Bart are killed in the fire. A couple months later, in 1973, Cathy's youngest son, who she had with her mother's second husband, Bart Winslow, also named Bart, is also born. In 1976, Paul dies, and Cathy and Chris begin their lives as a married couple, calling themselves the Sheffields, and they move to California. If There Be Thorns, which we're going to be talking about today, takes place in 1982. So for your reference, in If There Be Thorns, Jory is 14 years old, Bart is 9 years old, Chris is 40 years old, and Cathy is 37 years old. That's just some kind of real basic timeline stuff. Again, it doesn't cover every single event that we've talked about in the series thus far, because again, we'd be here all day. It also does not include the prequel novel or the final novel. Like I said, we'll cross those bridges when we get to them. So that's the timeline stuff. On to If There Be Thorns. So since Paul's death, Chris and Cathy and her 2 sons, Jory and Bart, have been living in Fairfax, California. They being Chris and Cathy, have been living as husband and wife since then. And the story that they have told everyone, with the exception of one person, put a pin in that, including their kids, is that, and you gotta stay with me here, after their parents and Corey died in a car accident, Cathy and Carrie ran away to avoid being put in the foster care system. They were found by Henny, who took them to Paul, who took them in. Paul was a widower who was raising his younger half-brother Chris, whose mother Corinne had been confined to a mental institution. Cathy didn't meet Chris until years later after she'd already married Bart. Eventually, Cathy would go on to become a famous ballerina and married Julian, who tragically died in a car accident, and she had Jory not long after his death. Carrie also sadly died very young of an illness, seems to be the implication. Cathy then married Paul a few years later, and they had Bart. So as far as Bart and Jory and anyone else knows, Paul was Bart's father. Sadly, however, when Bart was only a few years old, Paul also passed away, and Cathy then married Chris, and they and the kids moved to California. Okay? Okay. Now, despite the fact that they are hiding that they are brother and sister and have moved clear across the country to hide that fact, they and the kids still return to South Carolina every summer, so Jory can visit his grandmother, Marisha, who was Julian's mother, and Chris visits Corinne, who has been confined to a mental institution ever since she burned down Foxworth Hall, which caused the death of Bart Sr. and her mother, Olivia. Chris is the only one who visits, as the very sight of Cathy sends Corinne into violent fits of rage. Why does Chris still do this after literally everything? Honestly, I think it's guilt. And with the exception of Cathy, Corinne is all that's left of the family that they once had. So hate her though he does, and make no mistake, he very much hates her, it's probably hard to completely let go of her. Chris is better than me. Though the four of them, the Sheffields, have been living in California. Chris raising Cathy's sons as their stepfather, and they have a really good life. Chris is an incredibly successful doctor, and Cathy is a sought-after ballet teacher running a popular ballet school. They have a beautiful house, and Fairfax, if you're not familiar with California, where I dwell, is a town in Marin County, which is an extremely affluent area. They're successful, they're very well liked, and they have a lot of friends. Things are seemingly perfect. Keyword there, being seemingly. If There Be Thorns is the only book of the original four novels that's not narrated by Cathy. Instead, it's told from both Jory and Bart's POVs. And the two of them could not be more different. Jory is very handsome. He is very smart. He's also an incredibly talented ballet dancer like his mother and father. He's very popular and has a ton of friends, and also has this very romanticized and idealized view of his parents, Chris and Cathy, and their relationship, but also kind of views Julian, his father who passed away before he was born, as this kind of almost saint-like figure that he very much idealizes. Jory has very much put Chris and Cathy on a pedestal and hopes to someday have a relationship like theirs. The two of them, are very obviously very much in love and aren't afraid to show it. And he hopes that someday he and his girlfriend and fellow ballet dancer Melody, remember Melody, she doesn't play a huge role in this book, but she's very, very important in the next one, so remember her. And he hopes that one day they can have a relationship that's as loving and as strong as the one that his parents have. Then there's Bart, Jory's younger brother, and he is very much Jory's opposite. When we first meet him, he's this kind of perpetually dirty little 9-year-old kid who's always, in the dirt, in the mud. He's also very, very clumsy, and he often gets hurt, which is dangerous because he has a condition called CIP, congenital insensitivity to pain, which, to greatly oversimplify it, is a rare condition where a person can't feel physical pain. Meaning that if he gets hurt or sick and doesn't realize it, that he could possibly die. He also struggles in school. And because of that, and being compared to Jory, both by himself and other people, Bart has an incredibly low opinion of himself. He thinks he's ugly and thinks he's stupid and that no one likes him. And this often manifests as him being very cruel to the other kids and the adults in his life sometimes. So he really doesn't have many friends. Only confirms to him that he's unwanted and nobody likes him. It's a really, really vicious and tragic cycle that he's trapped in. So Bart spends most of his time alone, living in these very, very elaborate daydreams where he's a beloved hero or a pirate or a cowboy. He's the hero. He's beloved. I feel for Bart. I really do. He's very much a lonely kid that's desperate for attention, and that manifests in some really bad ways, because even bad attention is still attention, and that's what he desperately wants. As far as we can tell, from both Bart and Jory's perspectives, Chris and Cathy seem to be fairly good parents. However, there's also a lot of favoritism towards Jory, especially from Cathy. And I think this stems from her guilt about Julian and her having married him without really loving him. So she's trying to make up for that with Jory by loving him a lot to the detriment of Bart. To give Cathy grace, I think this is unintentional on her part, but she still very much favors Jory, and that's not fair to Bart. And while Jory is perfectly content with their seemingly idyllic life, Bart can kind of see the cracks in it. He often wonders to himself, and out loud, to Chris and Cathy's chagrin, why he doesn't really look like Paul, his father, right? And why would Cathy have married Paul first instead of Chris when they were so much closer in age? Also, why is Chris's mother in a mental institution, and why does she hate Cathy so much if he's never met her? Why have they never met her? So, despite Bart thinking of himself as not being very smart, he very obviously is. He's also incredibly observant, just like Cathy is. Despite the occasional hiccups, the Sheffields live a seemingly perfect life until two things happen that shatter the illusion, set them all on a collision course that will end with two people dead. The first thing is that a former student of Cathy's, Nicole Nichols, is in a car accident. Nicole survives, but just barely, and is in the hospital in critical condition, and she's probably not going to live much longer. Nicole has no family except for her 2-year-old daughter, Cindy. And Cathy wants to adopt Cindy, because again, it's very unlikely that Nicole is going to survive, and then Cindy is going to be put into foster care. Cathy also desperately wants to have a little girl, but her pregnancy with Bart was incredibly rough, and she nearly died giving birth to him, and she had a hysterectomy not long after he was born. Not that she could have any biological kids with Chris, which thankfully she doesn't. She's also extremely resentful of Chris, because he very much pressured her into having the hysterectomy because she would have died if she had any more biological kids. But I also can't help but wonder if he had his own reasons for pressuring her to do that, and so does Cathy. For a reference, this is one of the many fights that Chris and Cathy have about adopting Cindy that Jory overhears. Christopher, stop cringing behind your hands, show your face, and recognize what you made me do. You were there the night Bart was born, there with your pleading eyes telling me Paul wouldn't be enough and that it would be you in the end who won. If you hadn't been there pleading with those damned blue eyes, I wouldn't have let the doctors talk me into signing those papers and allowing the sterilization. I would have bore another child even if it did kill me. But you were there and I gave in for your sake, damn it. For your sake. So yikes. That's not great. That's not great. Though Chris is sympathetic to the situation that Nicole is in, he's still hesitant to adopt Cindy because, you know, they're a brother and sister living in secret as husband and wife, and if CPS or anyone else involved in the adoption process looked too deeply into their past, they would probably find out who they are and they'd lose everything. Chris's medical practice, Cathy's ballet school, and most importantly, their kids. Cathy, however, is convinced that she can convince Nicole to sign over custody of Cindy to them before she dies, ergo there would be no red tape. But Chris, who is a lot more cautious than Cathy, just personality-wise, doesn't want to risk it. It's just some pretty awful fights between the two of them. Although things never get physical between them, they are extremely, extremely cruel to one another. And while they do their best to hide their fights from the kids, Jory overhears a really nasty one in the attic after Chris returns home and finds Cathy dancing up there. And this is when he discovers what we talked about at the very, very end of Petals on the Wind, that she has actually gotten the attic ready to hide Bart and Jory away if she ever needed to. She has no recollection of doing this. She doesn't even realize that she's done it, as she did it in a dissociative state. But Chris sees this and he is horrified and confronts Cathy about it. And she, equally horrified, has no memory of this. Again, she did this in kind of a dissociative episode. And the conversation that Jory overhears between them is very revealing, as some of the things they say, talking about an attic and Chris having loved Cathy since he was 14, which again is just so painfully, horribly tragic to me, don't match up with what he's always been told about his parents his entire life. I was born shortly after he was killed. Then Mom married Daddy Paul, and Daddy Paul was Bart's father. It had been a long, long time before she met Chris, who was Daddy Paul's younger brother. So how could he have loved her when she was 14? Had they told us lies? This is Jory's first indication that they and their marriage are not as perfect as he's always believed. Not only that maybe what he knows about them and what they've always been told is not exactly the truth. I want to talk about Chris and Cathy for a second. So it kind of goes without saying that the parallels between Chris and Cathy and Christopher and Corinne, their parents, especially between Cathy and Corinne, are very, very stark. Hell, Cathy's greatest fear is that she's going to turn into their mother. This fear is further compounded by the fact that she looks exactly like Corinne and Chris looks exactly like Christopher. Dollenganger, doppelganger, you see what I'm getting at here. Chris and Cathy have in many ways followed in their parents' footsteps. They're living as husband and wife, though their parents were legally married, lying to their kids about their history, the incest, and Cathy even getting the attic ready, just in case. Corinne forced them into this destructive cycle of generational trauma and dysfunction when she locked them in that attic all those years ago. And despite being free of the attic itself for over 22 years at this point, both of them are successful and happy with 2 beautiful kids. They are still very much trapped, not in the attic, but in that cycle of generational trauma that Corinne was also trapped in, and now they have trapped Bart and Jory, despite their best intentions. The pathway to hell is paved with good intentions, and all that jazz. Needless to say, there's already a lot of tension in the house. While all this is going on, the Sheffields get a new neighbor, who moves into the rundown mansion next door and begins renovating it. And Bart and Jory are kind of upset by this because, it's a cool rundown mansion. They like to hang out and explore there. And it's while they're hanging out and exploring there that they meet their new neighbor, a very wealthy and seemingly eccentric old woman who dresses from head to toe in black and keeps her face hidden with a long black veil. She lives alone in the house with a man she introduces as her butler. Keep that in mind, put him in that. And she is delighted to meet them, overly so, and she is extremely, extremely overly friendly. She, as soon as she meets them, invites them over for cookies and cake and ice cream, and says that they can come over whenever they want and spend time with her, and that she would love to be a grandmother to them, and they can even call her that if they want, and she would really like them to call her that. I'm not going to leave you in any kind of suspense here. It's Corinne. It's Corinne. She's been released from the mental institution and has moved to California to be near her children and grandchildren. Though she has enough sense not to approach them directly, she's probably well aware that if she did approach Chris and Cathy, or God forbid Cathy's kids, that Cathy would probably beat the brakes off her. Put a pin in that. That's a fun pin for later. It's a fun pin for me anyway. I'm kind of a bad person, but I digress. This whole situation absolutely does not pass the vibe check for Jory. He listened to those stranger danger PSAs that they used to play on TV, apparently, and he very politely declines and drags Bart out of there. Bart, however, is so desperate to be someone's favorite, to be anyone's favorite, to have all of their attention focused on him, to finally have a grandmother on his own, as Marisha, who is Jory's biological grandmother, just straight up does not like him and does not hide the fact that she does not like him. So he starts sneaking over to visit Corinne and quickly becomes the absolute center of her entire world. Corinne gives Bart literally anything that he asks for. Expensive toys, including a real bow and arrow. She lets him eat meals that consist entirely of cookies, cakes, and candy and ice cream. She even gets him a dog, which Bart is initially disappointed by because his heart's desire, which he often calls it, have a pony of his own. But eventually Corinne convinces him that it would be too hard to house a pony, at least for now, though she does intend on eventually getting him one and even builds like a little mini stable on her property for the future pony. And Bart does eventually come to love the puppy. It's a St. Bernard puppy that he names Apple, and he keeps him over at Corinne's house, and he lives in the little stable. But most importantly, Corinne plays with him, she listens to him, she dotes on him. And why does she do this? Honestly, I do think she does love Bart as much as she's capable of that kind of thing. But I also think a part of it is jealousy. So Corinne has always been very jealous of Cathy, of her youth, of her beauty, of her talent, and I think that only got worse when Cathy started sleeping with Bart Sr. Hell, in the end, Bart essentially chose Cathy over her at the end of Paddles on the Wind when he says he's leaving with Chris and Cathy after everything comes out about Corinne and what she did. And honestly, in full disclosure, this is gonna get a little tinfoil hattish. on my part, but just stay with me here. I kind of think that's why Corinne started yelling about Olivia still being inside Foxworth Hall when the fire started. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, I think she did it because she knew Bart would go back in and get her. If she couldn't have Bart, then no one could have Bart. So I think part of her getting her claws into Bart, Cathy's son, and that jealousy she has of her daughter. Cathy got Bart Sr., however briefly, and she got to have his child. Again, something that Bart Sr. desperately wanted and Corinne couldn't give him. I also think that she saw Bart, Cathy's son, that's confusing, as her do-over kid. Like, yeah, I screwed up and murdered my own kids, but here's my chance to do it right. Put a pin in that because we're going to circle back to it near the end. But Corinne, unfortunately, isn't the only one who takes an interest in Bart. So Corinne has a butler whom she seems to absolutely despise, named John Amos Jackson. This is the same John who Chris heard gossiping about Bart Sr. and Corinne at the end of Flowers in the Attic all the way back when we talked about that. And he is the one who tells Bart that Corinne isn't just a lonely old lady. She really is his grandmother who was married to his real father. Yes, Bart, she's your grandmother. And not only that, she once was married to your father, your real father. Didn't know what to think, except that I was awful happy having a genuine grandmother of my very own, just like Jory had his own. And she wasn't dead or crazy. Don't bank on that last one, Bart. Bart, being 9 years old, has no idea what to do with any of that. But John Amos tells Bart that he, John Amos, was also a confidant of Malcolm Foxworth, who was Bart's great-grandfather, and even gives him Malcolm's journal, promising him that it will make him stronger and smarter and better than everyone else. Now you listen to me, boy, and you will never feel weak and ineffective again. You read a little of this book every day and it will teach you to be like your great-grandfather, Malcolm Neil Foxworth. Never on this earth did there live a man who was smarter than your own great-grandfather, the father of your grandmother, who sits in the rocker and wears that ugly black veil. He's not gonna pick you, John Amos. He's not gonna pick you. He's dead. And to painfully insecure Bart, who thinks so little of himself and wants so desperately to get out from Jory's shadow, the thought of being smart and strong is extremely appealing, and it's easy for John Amos to get into his head and start making Bart into what he wants him to be, a little mini copy of Malcolm Foxworth. I'm going to use that to kind of segue into talking about Malcolm Foxworth, because he is very much the ghost, metaphorical ghost, not literal ghost, that very much haunts Bart and his family for the rest of the series. Malcolm is an endlessly interesting character to me because we never really know who he is. We only see him very, very briefly in Flowers in the Attic, and that brief glimpse of him does not match at all with what we've learned about him from Corinne. Granted, to give grace where it's due, the abuse could be going on behind closed doors, but honestly, between me and all of you guys, I think Corinne was straight up lying to the kids to, 1, get their sympathy, so that, 2, they would shut up and stop asking her to let them out of the attic. And by the time we get to Petals on the Wind, Malcolm is long dead, and Corinne, who is now backed into a corner and confronted with what she'd done to her children, tries to pin the plan to imprison the kids on Malcolm, and again talks about how he tormented her, which Bart Sr. immediately shuts down. And again, like I said, the abuse could have been going on behind closed doors, out of sight of Malcolm's attorney, but again, between me and all of you, I think she's lying. And canon backs me up here because we learn the circumstances about the imprisonment of the kids in Garden of Shadows. And here, in If There Be Thorns, we get to see Malcolm through his own words. But again, that does not match up with the Malcolm that we meet in Garden of Shadows. He is the primary antagonist. I'm not trying to get too deep into the woods with Garden of Shadows because we're going to talk about that after the main series, but just keep all that in mind. Bart starts reading Malcolm's journal, and it is filled with these unhinged, fire and brimstone religious ramblings about lust and sin and hellfire and damnation, along with a significant amount of hatred and disdain for literally all womankind, because women are inherently sinful, evil, and lustful, and will lead godly men astray and should not be trusted ever. This is an entry from Malcolm where he's talking about his own mother. I knew I would never be deceived by any woman, no matter how beautiful. For it was beauty that put me in the attic, beauty that used the whip on my back. And it wasn't really my father's fault what he did. He was hurting too, like I was. Now I knew what he'd said all the time was true. No woman could be trusted, and most especially those with beautiful faces and seductive bodies. By the way, he's like 5 or 6 when he writes that in his journal. Do with that what you will. Just one of many, many entries, but I think you get the idea from that one. All in all, not great stuff for an impressionable 9-year-old kid to be internalizing. And all this hatred comes from the fact that when Malcolm was 5 years old, his mother, Corinne, who he named his daughter after, ran off and left him at the hands of his abusive father, Garland Foxworth, whose favorite way to punish Malcolm, as you can gather from that entry, was by whipping him and locking him in the attic for hours at a time. So this cycle has been going on long before Corinne ever put her 4 kids in the attic. And not great stuff for a little kid to be reading about. And horribly insecure Bart, who already thinks Cathy doesn't love him as much as she loves Jory, becomes absolutely terrified that Cathy is going to just up and leave him one day, like Corinne left Malcolm all those years ago. I too had always been scared my mama might up and go for no reason except she didn't want to be near me anymore, and I'd be left alone with a stepfather who couldn't possibly love me as much as if I'd been his own true son. Jory would be all right, for he had his dancing, and that was all that really mattered to him. And this always just makes me so sad. This poor little kid thinks so little of himself that he thinks his mom is just going to up and leave him because she doesn't like him. I hate what Bart becomes later, especially when we see him in the beginning in Seeds of Yesterday, but I do genuinely feel for him here. And the more time Bart spends with John Amos, who spouts the same hell and damnation misogyny that's in the journal, and the more time he spends reading Malcolm's own words, it really starts to affect him. Bart starts imitating Malcolm. He walks like him, starts talking like him, even using like an older old man voice, and his anger issues get worse and worse, much to the concern and confusion of his parents and brother, who he becomes increasingly physically and verbally violent towards. So all in all, on top of all the tension already in the house, this is not a great situation, so we're only going to make things worse, because not long after, Nicole passes away, with Chris and Cathy by her side, and they take in Cindy. As you can imagine, Bart does not take this well. He's already feeling neglected and has John Amos in his ear, and he's getting deeper and deeper into Malcolm's journal and trying to become more and more like him. And now there's a new baby in the house taking everyone's attention. This goes about as well as you'd expect, which is to say really badly. Bart hates Cindy. He hates her. And not just like, you have some kind of sibling rivalry or maybe even some animosity towards your siblings. He hates her. He picks on her and says really awful things about her and to her, that she's evil and that she's sinful. Again, we have that cycle repeating itself. And he even cuts off her hair to make her ugly. Time is a flat circle. We've seen this all before. And now Chris and Cathy are at a loss for what's going on with Bart, because he's walking around pretending to be a dying old man, threatening and hurting them and his siblings, and nothing they try seems to be working or stopping the behaviors, which are getting increasingly worse. But Jory knows Bart has been visiting the old woman next door and realizes that Bart started acting like this around the same time that those visits started. So he decides to go and confront her because he's 14 years old and doesn't want to get his brother in trouble. And he thinks if he goes and talks to this woman that, she's an adult, she'll see reason, and he can put a stop to it and Bart will go back to the way he was. And meanwhile, Jory is also starting to remember pieces of things that he didn't before. He has a little white dog named Clover that was given to him by a man named Bart, just like his brother. And he has no idea what to make of that, because why would this strange man have the same name as his brother? Bart is Paul's son. That's so weird. What's up with that? So Jory goes to confront Corinne, who is absolutely overjoyed to see him to an uncomfortable degree. And Jory, being the nice kid that he is, tells her that he gets that she's lonely, but hanging out over here with her is having a really bad effect on his brother, so she needs to please leave him alone. And just like she used to do with her own kids, Corinne immediately turns on the tears and starts trying to guilt Jory, telling him that she made a mistake, which is certainly one way to put it, and lost her own children when married for the second time. My 4 children hated me for doing that. She stared down at her hands folded on her lap, then began to twist the sparkling gems one by one. She's wearing like these really, really expensive diamond-encrusted rings. By the way, children always think that adults have it so easy. That's not always true. Children think a widowed mother doesn't need anyone but them. She sighed. They think they can give her enough love because they don't understand there are all kinds of love, and it's hard for a woman to live without a man once she's been married. I'm not even going to attempt to unpack that. Simply say this: Corinne, they could never make me like you. Jory is understandably super uncomfortable and confused by all this and is like, okay, that's nice. I'm out of here. Please leave Bart alone. But before he leaves, Corinne absolutely insists that he check out this life-sized oil painting that she just got in. Why does she want him to check out this oil painting? I'm so glad you asked. Full disclosure, this is going to be a really, really long scene that I'm going to read to you, but it's relevant, so just stay with me. But again, it is kind of a long one. It was an oil painting the men unwrapped. There stood my beautiful mother in a formal white gown, pausing on the next to the bottom step with her slender hand resting on a magnificent newel post. Trailing behind her lay yards and yards of shimmering white fabric. The curving stairs behind her rose gracefully and faded into swirling mists, through which the artist had cleverly managed to give the impression of gold and glittering jewels, hinting at a palace-like mansion. Do you know whose portrait that is? She asked, when the men had hung it in place in one of the parlors she didn't seem to use often. I nodded, dumbfounded and speechless. What was she doing with my mother's portrait? She waited for the men to go. They smiled, thrilled with the tip she gave them. I was panting, hearing my own heavy breathing and wondering why. I felt sort of numb. Jory, she said softly, turning again to me, that's a portrait of me, that my second husband commissioned shortly after we were married. I was 37 when I posed for that. In the portrait, the woman looked just like my mother looked today. I swallowed and wanted to run, suddenly needing the bathroom badly, but I still wanted to stay. I wanted to hear her explain, even though I was paralyzed with fear at what she might tell me. My second husband, who was younger, was named Bartholomew Winslow, Jory, she said quickly as if to make sure I heard before I got up and ran. Later on, when my daughter was old enough, she seduced him, stole his love away from me just so she could hurt me with the child she gave him, the child I couldn't have. Can you guess who that child is? Can you? Now Jory knows at least a part of the truth. Bart isn't Paul's son. His parents lied to him. They lied to Bart, and they have been lying to them and literally everyone else for their entire lives. This image of them that Jory has had of them being perfect is starting to fall apart. And he's honestly starting to wonder what else they lied about. And why. Before Jory can tell his parents anything, or even begin to process any of that, because Jesus, that was a lot, Bart gets sick. While he's playing in the stable that Corinne had built for him, he gets poked by a rusty nail, which because he has CIP, he doesn't realize, and it ends up getting infected, and he ends up getting tetanus and nearly dying. And it's Chris who saves his life, who cares for him for the weeks and weeks that he is in the hospital, and during his fever, Bart keeps asking for apple, which confuses Chris and Cathy because why does he want to eat apples? However, Jory understands that this is his secret puppy, so to make Bart feel better, he goes to check on him and finds that John Amos has chained Apple in the stable and left him to starve. Jory is horrified and disgusted by this, as he should be, and confronts Corinne and John Amos. To give Corinne some grace, which I don't like to do, she genuinely didn't know what John Amos was doing, and Jory tells her that if she cares about Bart at all, that she'll take care of his dog. Which she ends up doing. She goes out there and she feeds him and makes sure he has water. Sad to say, put a pin in John Amos nearly starving Apple to death. Because that comes back in a really kind of strange way that I'm going to speculate on here in a bit. Thankfully, Bart does end up making a full recovery and is released from the hospital. However, once he gets home, things only get worse. So in this next part, I'm going to be speculating about animal death and animal abuse. So if you want to avoid that, I totally understand it. And I'm going to leave a time skip in the pinned comment, so utilize that if you need to. So, just before Bart got sick, Jory's dog Clover went missing. And not long after he gets home from the hospital, Jory finds Clover has been strangled and has been dead since he went missing. And he thinks Bart did this. Bart hated Clover because Clover favored Jory and was often kind of mean to him. And then there's Corinne's kitten. There was a little stray kitten that she used to feed that Bart didn't like because it took attention away from him. A little kitten that turns up dead not long after Bart imagines killing a tiger in one of his very elaborate daydreams. So is Bart killing these animals? Honestly, I don't know. I'm personally of the opinion that John Amos is the one who killed Clover, but I think it's possible that Bart killed the kitten. And later, spoilers kind of, I guess, Apple ends up dead as well. He ends up stabbed with a pitchfork after being starved again. Now, I think it's absolutely possible that John Amos killed him, but I also think it might have been Bart. When Bart visits Apple after he gets out of the hospital, he is angry at both Corinne and at Apple because she took care of him, and now he thinks that Apple loves her more than him. Is it possible that Bart killed him out of a kind of misguided and warped sense of jealousy? Honestly, I think it is. Like Cathy, he has these kind of dissociative episodes where he does things and doesn't remember doing them. But I also think John Amos could have done these things to manipulate Bart into thinking he doesn't have anyone left who loves him, so that Bart leans on John Amos even more. Finding Clover dead is the last straw for Jory, and he finally tells Chris and Cathy about the old woman next door and the way she's been giving Bart really extravagant gifts, and their general kind of weird relationship. But before either of them can do anything about their son being a potential serial killer, Bart nearly drowns Cindy in her kiddie pool one day while Chris is at work. Terrified, Cathy locks Bart in the attic. Yeah. She also tells him she's going to spank him if he doesn't stop what he's doing, but Bart does not care, and tells her, quite frighteningly, "You lay one hand on me and I'll wait till you're in your old ballet class, and then I'll get Cindy." And Emma is kind of their live-in housekeeper and nanny, "won't be able to stop me. I can be in 1,000 places before she can move to one, and the police won't put me in jail because I'm a minor. Bart, I'm losing patience with you. Won't be all you'll lose if you hit me," I bellow. That whole series of events is absolutely terrifying, and it's finally, what pushes Chris and Cathy to put Bart in therapy. And the psychiatrist tells them that Bart hates himself, and he hates Chris, and he hates Jory, and he hates Cathy. But he also loves Cathy to an almost obsessive degree, and thus holds her to this insanely high standard of perfection that she, and no one, could possibly live up to. And when she doesn't live up to the impossible standards that he sets for her, he hates her, yet he craves her attention. And Chris and Cathy do their best to try and support Bart, but his behaviors just keep getting worse and worse and worse, and he spends more time being Malcolm than he does being Bart. They're starting to lose him. Well, all this is happening because we truly don't have enough going on. Cathy and her ballet students, including Jory and Melody, are preparing for a recital which she plans to dance, despite Chris's protest, as she has a bad knee that's only gotten worse as she's gotten older. But she assures him that it's just a short part and nothing could possibly go wrong. So naturally, everything goes horribly, horribly wrong. During the dance, the ribbons of Cathy's ballet shoes comes untied and she slips on them and she falls. And she falls bad. She ends up tearing a bunch of ligaments in her leg, which needs surgery to fix, and she ends up confined to a wheelchair until she heals. And she'll never dance again. This is so devastating because Cathy has been a dancer all her life, literally since she was a toddler. She taught her son how to dance. She was a famous ballet dancer. Hell, it was the thing that kept her motivated during her imprisonment, and she is heartbroken, and so am I, honestly. And while Cathy is recovering, Chris brings her a typewriter because it's 1982 and tells her Dad brought to the hospital a portable typewriter, a thick stack of yellow legal pads, and other writing utensils. He stacked everything on the table that rolled over Mom's bed and gave her one of his big, charming smiles. "This is a fine time to finish that book you began so long ago," he said. "Look at your old journals and let it all loose, and be damned to those you might hurt. Hurt them as you've been hurt, as I've been hurt. Stab them a few times for Corey and Carrie too. And while you're at it, throw in a few blows for me, Bart, and Jory, for they too are affected." The implication here is that the books that we've been talking about, that we've been reading, are Cathy's memoirs that she seems to be intending on publishing and then exposing everything that happened to them. And this is such an interesting plot point, and I wish more was done with it, especially later in the series, because again, this is just so endlessly fascinating to me that the 4 original novels are meant to be Cathy's memoirs. And this is such an interesting plot point to me, and I wish more was done with it. Put a big pin in that. We're going to circle back to it when we get to the last book, but just, for your reference, that these are supposed to be Cathy's memoirs. Oh, Cathy throws herself into writing almost obsessively, probably because she's kept all of this pushed down for so long, so she's finally getting it all out. Bart, however, isn't getting any better, and after Jory begs him, Chris finally goes to visit the woman next door. And Chris immediately recognizes Corinne. She's still wearing the same rings, and he freaks out, understandably so. And Jory then realizes that this is Chris's mother, which doesn't make any sense, because why does he keep calling her Mrs. Winslow when shouldn't she be Mrs. Sheffield? What the hell is going on here? So the jig is finally up, and Corinne admits that before she officially moved into the house where she lived, into California as a whole, she got her lawyers to get Chris and Cathy a good deal on their house. She's still trying to buy them, basically, but Chris isn't falling for it, and tells her that if she doesn't move, they will. And they absolutely want nothing to do with her and to leave them and their children alone. And like she has done time and again, guess what Corinne does? She immediately turns on the tears and begs Chris to forgive her. "Please, Christopher," she begged. "I have no other family and no others who care if I live or die. Don't deny me your love, and to do so will kill the very best part of you, the part that makes you what you are. You've never been like Cathy." Again, always jabs at Cathy. Always you could hold on to some of your love. Hold fast to it now, Christopher. Hold so fast and true so you can eventually help Cathy find a little love for me too. Rin has nothing but the audacity, but Chris still isn't buying it, and he tells her that if she has any love for them at all, that she'll just leave them alone, because she's still hurting them. Hell, she's hurting their children. She's hurting Bart. And poor freaking Jory is just standing there trying to figure out what she could possibly have done to make her own son hate her. Seeing that begging isn't going to work, Corinne tries pity and lifts her veil to show Chris that she deliberately scarred her face so that she wouldn't look like Cathy anymore, and she has been wearing all black as a kind of atonement. And Jory, sweet kid that he is, feels bad for her and tells Chris maybe he should forgive her. Again, I feel just so bad for Jory here. But again, Chris tells her to go to hell and to leave them alone, so Corinne tells him, well, wouldn't it be a shame if people knew exactly what he and Cathy were to each other? And Chris tells her, yeah, sure, that would be terrible, but you know what's worse than that? Child murder. Basically, if they go down, they're taking Corinne with them. I respect that. Hand an unlovable hand and all that. So as they're leaving, Jory asks what Corinne did to make Chris hate her so much. Chris doesn't really give him an answer and tells him under no circumstances is he to tell Cathy about any of that, which he reluctantly agrees to. But Chris and Cathy's lies are starting to fall apart, and on their way home, they find Apple dead. And although Chris has his doubts, a part of him does kind of wonder if it was Bart who did it. Later, Chris goes back to confront Corinne more, but without Jory this time. However, Bart spies on their conversation and learns the truth about his real father, that his father was not Paul Sheffield, Bart Winslow, who was Corinne's husband that Cathy stole from her. And he is absolutely shattered by this, and it only makes his feelings of being rejected and unwanted so much worse. And again, Chris begs Corinne to just go and leave them alone, because hasn't she done enough to them? But Corinne just keeps making excuses for herself. And I think that's what is so frustrating about her as a character, that even all these years later, she still won't take any kind of responsibility for what she did to the kids. Even all this time later. And seeing that Chris is unmoved by any of this, Corinne reluctantly agrees to leave, but she has conditions. And thus we're circling back to that very first pen I mentioned. Let me have Bart as my own son. You have Jory and that little girl you adopted. Let me take Bart and go away, so far away you'll never see or hear from me again. I swear I'll never let anyone know about you and Cathy. I'll do what I can to protect your secret. But let me have Bart as my own. Please, please, please. She fell to her knees and clutched at his hands, and he quickly moved them out of her reach. Like I said, she wants Bart as her do-over kid. She feels Cathy specifically owes her Bart because she never got to have a child with Bart Sr., a child that Corinne feels should have been hers. Naturally, Chris tells Corinne that unlike her, they just don't up and ditch their kids, but he reluctantly agrees to let Bart keep visiting her, but he wants her to keep John Amos away from him because John Amos is kind of a creep and Chris can sense that. And she also tells her not to tell Bart that she's his real grandmother. However, as Bart has been eavesdropping, he learns all of this and takes it about as well as you can expect, which is to say really badly. He runs home where he runs into Cathy, who can see that something is wrong and tries to comfort him, but Bart isn't having it. He feels like everyone is lying to him, parents and even Corinne, who he put so much trust in, which they kind of are. And everything he knows about his life and about his parents and about himself is a lie. Hell, he just found out that the man he thought was his father wasn't actually, and that his real father died in a house fire. His entire life is a lie, and that is a lot to handle. She being Cathy, was unfaithful to all her husbands, but I couldn't say any of this. My legs went rubbery and weak and made me sink to the floor as all the silent screams bounced in my head. Wicked, sinful, evil woman. Sooner or later she'd run away with some lover, like Malcolm's mother did. Like all mothers did. Why hadn't my grandmother come right out and told me who she was? Why was she keeping it a secret? Didn't she know I needed a real grandmother? She even lied to me about who my daddy was. Only John Amos told me the truth. This just drives Bart deeper and deeper into his Malcolm persona because Malcolm is strong and in control, and Bart's life is spiraling out of control, so it's easier to be Malcolm. It also drives him closer and closer to John Amos, who assures him that they're going to punish all the wicked, evil people who have hurt Bart. And again, this is very appealing to a hurt kid who feels rejected and wronged and lied to. This action will have consequences. The divide between Bart and his family is only getting deeper and deeper, and Cathy is losing herself in her memories and the trauma of everything she's gone through as she writes her story, their story. And given how tense things are, and with Cathy still recovering, though she's out of a wheelchair at this point, Jory decides to call Marisha, who of course immediately gets on a plane and heads to California. So Marisha is the only person, remember I talked about this at the very beginning, who got a different version of the story Chris and Cathy told their kids. As far as Marisha knows, Cathy is still married to Paul, who never comes with them when they come to visit because he's simply too sick to travel. And as soon as Marisha gets to the house in California, which she's never been to before, she notices things, and she starts asking questions. Where's Paul? You know, Paul, your husband. Why is your brother living with you? Where is his room? Hey, why haven't I seen Paul since I've been here? That's kind of weird. The house of cards that Chris and Cathy have built is falling down hard. And because Marisha wasn't born yesterday, she realizes that Paul is gone and that Chris and Cathy have been raising the kids as husband and wife. And she is understandably horrified by this because, incest bad. So she confronts Cathy about it, telling her that Chris and Cathy, are adults and can do what they want, but raising the kids in this environment is unhealthy for them, and that she, Cathy, never loved Julian, which is what Marisha is most upset about, and that she's going to take Jory away from here. But Cathy immediately fires back and confronts Marisha about her own abuse of Julian, and finally tells her about the abuse that Cathy suffered during her marriage to him. You have never given me credit for having mercy on Julian. I did the best I could for him. He was not an easy man to live with. You and your husband made him what he was. Not me. I didn't force him to dance when he would have played ball if given his way. I didn't punish him by making him practice every weekend so he never had time for fun. You and Georges did that, but it was me who paid the price. Me he wanted to devour alive, forbidding me any friends but him, jealous of every man who looked my way, every man I looked at. Do you know what it is to live with a man who suspects you deceive him out of his sight? And it wasn't me who did the betraying, it was him. I was faithful to Julian. I never let another man touch me, but he couldn't have said the same thing. He wanted every pretty girl he saw. He wanted to use them, discard them, and then come back to me and have me hold him in my arms and tell him how wonderful he was. And I couldn't say he was wonderful when the stench of some other woman's perfume was all over him. Then he'd hit me. Did you know that? He had something to prove to himself. I didn't know then what he had to prove, but now I do. He had to find the love you denied him. Jory unfortunately overhears all of this, and his entire world shatters. His parents have been lying to him literally his entire life. Also, they're literally brother and sister, which is a hell of a thing to find out. And not only that, his parents didn't have a beautiful romance that was cut short. And his father wasn't some good man. They had a very toxic relationship, and his father abused his mother. That is an awful thing to find out and to try and take in. And to make things worse, because apparently they're not bad enough, Bart has been stealing the pages of Cathy's manuscript and has been reading them. So he has learned the truth too about Chris and Cathy and about what Corinne did to them. And he comes undone. Things start spiraling out of control, and Bart tries to stab Cathy while she's holding Cindy after confronting her about her and Chris being brother and sister. Thankfully, Cathy is able to disarm him and actually locks him in his room while she calls Chris and tells him what's going on. However, Bart has gone completely off the rails at this point. He's locked in his room. Bart is screaming at Cathy. He's saying that he is going to hurt himself, that if she doesn't let him out, he is going to kill himself, that when he gets out, he is going to tell everyone about Chris and Cathy committing incest, and not only that the people next door were right about her. And that last bit is what gets her to open the door. What do you mean the people next door told you everything? Who are the people next door? You'll find out when you see her, I said smugly, all of a sudden mean again. That Cindy she had to hold on to all the time was me she gave birth to, not Cindy. There's an old man over there too. He knows about you and your attic days. Just go over and talk to them, Mama, and you won't feel so happy to have a daughter anymore. And with that deeply unsettling thing, that's just about enough for Cathy, so she takes Cindy and goes next door to find out what the hell is going on. And Bart follows her, partially because he wants to hurt her like he's hurting, but also because he's scared, and he knows that John Amos might hurt her, and he doesn't want her to get hurt, because as much as he hates her, Bart still very much loves her. And so Cathy goes next door to confront Corinne, who in a truly, truly bizarre move pretends to be a woman in a niqab who doesn't speak English. Which, okay. And she would have gotten away with it too, except Cathy sees her pearls. She knows those pearls. They're the same pearls Corinne was wearing at the Christmas party. And the same rings, too. You, cried my mother, I should have known. There's no other rope, necklace of pearls with a butterfly clasp except yours. Of course you are sick, screamed my mother. what else could you be but sick? That's in reference to Corinne telling Cathy that, she was sick, so she had to leave, which again is okay. How dare you come into my life again? After all you've done to us, you come back to do more. I hate you. I hate you for everything you've done. But I've never had the chance to pay you back. Taking Bart from you wasn't enough. Now I have the chance to do more. And then Cathy proceeds to beat the living daylights out of Corinne. And you know what? Good for her. There, I said it. Good for her. I'm a bad person. Do with that what you will. Sadly, John Amos arrives and breaks up the fight. And this is when we find out that he is not just Corinne's butler. He is her husband. He is her husband. According to Corinne later, but it's relevant now, John Amos, who was Olivia's third cousin, was always kind of a creep towards her, and her parents never believed her when she tried to tell them that. And after her brothers died, as if you remember, Corinne actually had two older brothers who died when they were quite young. When they died, Malcolm seemed to imply to John Amos that if Corinne ever fell out of favor with him, that he'd get everything. And if Corinne had never come back after Christopher died, he would have gotten everything. So he forced her to marry him after she got released from the mental institution. Put a pin in all that. We're not going to circle back to it until we get to Garden of Shadows. Just put a pin in that. Put a pin in all that. That's a lot. Just remember it for when we get there. But Cathy will not be stopped, and she actually gets away from John Amos and just keeps beating the brakes off Corinne. All around my grandmother she whirled, flicking out her hand to slap her, and even as she whipped her legs around, she screamed, "I should have known it was you. Ever since you moved in, Bart's been acting crazy. You couldn't leave us alone, could you? You had to come here and try and ruin what Chris and I found together. The first time we've been happy. And now you've ruined it. You've managed to drive Bart insane, so he'll have to be put away like you were. Oh, how I hate you for that. I hate you for so many reasons. Corey, Carrie, and now Bart. There is no end to what you can do to hurt us." Bart is watching all this, feeling very torn, because he thinks Cathy is evil and needs to be punished for her sins, but also wanting to protect her, but also being kind of impressed, because Cathy's hands are in fact rated E for everyone, and when John Amos tries to intervene, she starts kicking the crap out of him too. Like I said, these hands are rated E for everyone. Eventually, once she realizes Bart is there, Cathy decides that enough is enough and it's time to go. However, when she turns her back on John Amos, he knocks her out with a fireplace poker, and does the same to Corinne when she goes to help Cathy. And Bart is upset by this, but John Amos assures him that this is all part of God's plan, and that they're going to save Cathy and Corinne. "God spoke to me last night and told me what to do. Didn't you hear your mother say that she was going far, far away? She wouldn't take a bothersome boy like you with her, would she? Wouldn't she put you away first in some institution? Then she'd go. And never would you see her again, Bart. Just like your great-grandfather, you'd be abandoned forever. Just like your grandmother, you'd be locked up. And you'd never see her again either. That's the cruel way life treats those who try to do their best. And it's me, only me, who is trying to take care of you and see you escape confinement. Worse than prison." Amos is like a master manipulator, because again, Bart is just so confused and so twisted by everything that John Amos has told him and everything that he has learned about his parents, that he kind of falls for this hook, line, and sinker. Greatest fear is that Cathy is going to up and leave him because she doesn't like him as much as she likes Jory. And John Amos absolutely plays up that fact. However, Bart is still kind of wavering, and he loves his mother and grandmother and doesn't want them to be hurt. So John Amos lies and promises that he won't hurt them. He'll just lock them up so they'll never leave Bart again, and he can see them whenever he wants, and they'll be just his. And this poor kid is just so lost and freaking damaged and just so desperate, to be the center of attention, to be loved, to make sure that the people who love him don't up and leave him, that he readily agrees to this. So before I continue, even though there's not a lot of book left at this point, we're in the home stretch, folks, There's still a lot that happens, so I'm going to kind of rapid fire these next bits, so just kind of stay with me. Bart takes Cindy home, because remember, Cindy, the baby, has been here the whole time and puts her to bed, threatening to hurt her if she ever said anything, and just kind of acts like nothing happens, while John Amos locks Cathy and Corinne in the basement. While all this is going on, Marisha and Jory have a kind of come-to-Jesus moment where she realizes that she wanted to take Jory for her, to kind of atone for her failings with Julian, and not to help him, and that it would be cruel to him to take him from his mother. Chris and Jory get home and Cathy isn't there, but her car is, and it's raining like crazy, so she didn't go far. Thanks to Cindy, shout out to Cindy, they realize that Cathy went out in the rain and figure out pretty quickly where she went and go looking for her. John Amos, of course, denies that Cathy is there and claims that Corinne went to Hawaii, which Chris doesn't believe because, yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but there's not a lot he can do. It takes about a day and a half, closer to 2 days, before Cathy and Corinne are found, for your reference. Art goes next door and watches them every day and finds Corinne desperately trying to take care of Cathy, who has a pretty significant head injury on top of a pretty bad cold that she had before. And Cathy is disorientated and thinks she's back in the attic and calls out for Corey and Carrie, which devastates Corinne and me, because in so many ways, Cathy is still that little girl that was locked in the attic. And I think this is when Corinne finally realizes that all of this is her fault. Her actions led them here. She did this. It's her fault. Better late than never, I guess. Mama, are you still there, Mama? Yes, darling, I'm here, and I'll take care of you, as I never took care of you before. This time I'll be the mother that I should have been. This time, I'll save you and Chris. However, time is running out, because John Amos has decided to kill them, which Bart is still unsure about, because he's learned that John Amos is a creep and that Malcolm wasn't a good guy either. At this point, he's overheard Corinne telling Cathy about her marriage to John Amos and that he was a creep, and that Malcolm didn't believe that he was a creep, and so if they were only pretending to be righteous, how can this be what God really wants? And then he hears Cathy and Corinne talking about how Cathy had Bart, even though there was a chance that she could have died. It was Chris who came to me each summer and talked to me about you, who made me see your side of the affair with my husband. He told me you really loved Bart, that you should have had Bart's child aborted for your own health, but you wouldn't have done it. You wanted to keep his baby, Cathy. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for giving me another Bart, for he is mine as Jory will never be. I'm not gonna touch that. Okay, Corinne, okay. Oh, they both loved me. Mama had risked her health to give me life. Grandmother had stopped hating Mama on account of me. I wasn't nearly as bad as I thought. Again, this is just so sad to me. So sad to me. Regardless of what Bart becomes later, he breaks my heart in this book. Again, Corinne begs for forgiveness, and again, Cathy attacks her, and in the process, knocks over a candle, which starts a fire. And when Bart goes to get help, John Amos, who planned to start a house fire while he was away and make it look like an accident, I think so he could collect the inheritance and the insurance, hits Bart, and Jory jumps him. And Amos then tries to blame Bart for the fire when Chris gets there, which solidifies to Bart that he's a liar and a bad person and can't be trusted because he lied on his name. And Bart finally tells Chris where Cathy and Corinne are. However, the fire has spread and the entire house is engulfed in flames at this point. Thankfully, Chris gets to them in time and gets them out of the basement. However, as he is coming out of the fire, John Amos hits Chris with a shovel and knocks him out. And Bart, who, unbeknownst to Chris, followed him into the house, is now missing. John Amos then tries to beat Chris and Cathy to death with a shovel, but Jory stops him, and Corinne tells him to get him and his parents away from the house because there's gasoline stored in the garage, and she goes back in to look for Bart. And John Amos follows her and tries to kill her, which, by guy, I'm not trying to tell you how to commit murder, but why not just wait for her to die in the fire? But okay. He tries to choke her, but Corinne kills him by hitting him with a crystal ashtray. Good. And that's when Bart appears. confused and delirious and trying to drag the giant portrait of Corinne out of the fire because he's having a bit of a breakdown and thinks it's his mother and he's trying to save her. This is such a horribly sad moment because this poor little kid has been driven to the point of a breakdown and is so far gone at this point that he's trying to save a painting. Thankfully, Cathy wakes up and is able to convince Bart to let go of the painting and leave with her. And it's so sad because even as she's literally saving his life, he's questioning if she loves him. And she's on the verge of passing out. So Jory takes Bart and Corinne leads Cathy out of the house. Corinne manages to shove Cathy out of the house just before she catches fire. Corinne is able to put the fire out on Corinne just as the fire department arrives to put out the house. But Corinne is dead. Cathy and Chris are the last Dollengangers left. The days and weeks that follow, things slowly start to get better. Jory comes to a place where he can forgive Chris and Cathy for lying to them. Cathy and Marisha make peace and actually become really close. Bart is attending therapy regularly and is doing at least somewhat better than he was. But that bitterness and anger and resentment, especially towards Chris, Cathy, and the jealousy towards Cindy and Jory, is still very much there. We also learn that Corinne set up trusts for all three kids, that the Foxworth fortune now goes to Jory, Bart, and Cindy, which they'll come into when they turn 25. But what remains of Foxworth Hall will go to Bart. And Bart is a very different kid than the one we met at the beginning of the book. He's obsessively neat and clean because that's something he can control. And he still isn't sure who he is. Is he Bart Sheffield? Is he Bart Winslow? Is he Bart Foxworth? And how much of Malcolm and John Amos is still in him? Only time will really tell. The epilogue finds us back in Cathy's point of view, and we learn that they flew Corinne's body back to be buried beside Bart Sr., at Bart's insistence. It's during her funeral that Cathy finally grieves for her mother and is able to find forgiveness for her. I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I think narratively it makes sense, and there is a certain catharsis in Cathy finally letting go of her hatred, and to be clear, I don't think this in any way absolves Corinne of what she did in the narrative. The narrative does not excuse Corinne's actions at all, or automatically forgive her because she finds Cathy's forgiveness. But on the other hand, and I fully acknowledge that this is a personal gripe on my part, because like I told you, if there's one thing I'm going to do, it's hold a grudge. I will, in fact, heal in hell. I don't think Corinne deserves forgiveness. Like I said, that's kind of more of a personal gripe, but I digress. So Cathy fully intends to publish her books, to expose what Corinne, Olivia, and Malcolm did to her and Chris and Corey and to Bart and Jory, to tell the truth about everything and finally banish the ghosts of Malcolm Foxworth and Foxworth Hall once and for all. Yet despite things seemingly getting better, Cathy acknowledges that this isn't a happy ending, and they won't truly be free of the ghosts and the lies and the secrets until they and their children are free from the cycle of generational trauma that they're trapped in, because until they are free, history is just going to keep repeating itself. These are the final two paragraphs of If There Be Thorns. For some reason, I glance up then. Bart was sitting in a shadowy corner again, holding in his hands a red volume that appeared to be covered in leather with gold tooling. Silently he read, his lips moving as he mouthed the words of a great-grandfather he'd never seen. I shivered, for Malcolm's journal had burned in the fire. The book Bart held was a cheap imitation of leather, and every page was blank. Not that it mattered. Thanks so much for listening to all that, and for just being here. Seriously, it means more than I can say, so to put it simply, thank you. And until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.